Okay, for people joining this live stream, we are talking about the handling of historical entities in Wolfram Language. And some of our merry band are having technical difficulties, so will be with us soon, but we're going to start on a piece of this agenda that we can handle now. Okay, so this is functions for date interval arithmetic.
Yeah, and I just sent you a supplemental notebook with sort of the current state of date interval. But so this particular example, I don't think is super interesting in the agenda because it doesn't actually give us a meaningful interval. There's not an intersection between those 2 points. But if you have a prototype build, these evaluations will run. Okay. Or we can look at the existing output.
Well, let's look at the examples, but I'll start the prototype build.
Yeah, and so sort of the 2 pending questions that we have with the design of date interval is whether it will need to automatically include a granularity specification.
By the way, that's encouraging. There's some uncaught throw in the login.
I think I saw some.
Okay, well, may or may not work here. Okay, fine. So let's take a look. Date interval of today.
Mm-hmm.
That is a really grotesque way to specify that, if I might say so.
Yeah, we were looking at doing some intelligent detection to say, oh, this is obviously a day or a week or a month.
I think what we should say is, first of all, we might be able to do something with that little funny thing, which I'm not the wildest on that icon, in fact, but I mean, I think that icon could get a little softer. It's a little harsh, visible. But then we could imagine something where there's a little bar in here that indicates that's an interval. And then we could say 18th April 29 paren whole day or something to indicate that it's the date interval representing the whole day.
Okay. Yeah, I think that could make sense.
And then we could say, whole week, whole. Well, we don't need to say whole week. We'd say whole month. April 2019 paren whole month. And then what we'd start with is, and then this icon would change slightly. That makes sense?
Okay, we'd have the icon vary depending on the
whether it's an interval or not. Whether it's an interval.
Whether it's an interval or not. Okay.
I would say we just do something that indicates, intervalness in that icon.
Okay. So as a general design question, I still don't have a solid opinion on whether we want to say there's a granularity associated with the interval such that if I have all of this year, but the thing I'm interested in is sampling basically every day, whether that is part of the interval specification or that's part of the function that operates on it.
I understand the issue.
Yeah.
The underlying thing is that in date object, we have included both the instant object and the granular object. So
and the granularity, you're saying. So in other words, you're saying it is anchored to this instant, the day around this instant. Is that correct?
Well, it's not so much that as the representation. So we could have created a separate object for the continuous point-wise object and the granular discrete object, but we have the same. So now that we have intervals of point-wise objects, the question is whether we want also the interval of discrete objects.
Okay, so what's the difference between day and whole day?
So the granular day is the discrete single object that identifies a day. It's like a different type, while an interval that extends for a day is the collection of all instants of that day. It's a different thing.
Wait. Okay, so one thing is the granular object. The other is the union of all instants within that object.
Exactly.
So the representation of this as a date interval, we will be literally calling this date interval But would it have the same innards, or would it have an instant-to-instant set of innards?
The current notion is to go from instant to instant. We have there's the general question of the representation of instants in handling open and closed points, but the general current idea is that you have first included instant and either first excluded instant or last included instant. The current notion right now basically is inclusive, so that's why we get machine reals on the second point when we look at some of the other outputs.
Okay.
And so then the question sort of is there a meaningful difference between an interval that is this entire year from the first instant of it until the last, and one that's that same period of time, but we essentially say the granularity is in days. So it's every day between there, but it's not necessarily, at least semantically, the same as every instant within that time period.
I understand. So the default date interval would be every instant, just as the default date object is an instant.
Correct.
But then the idea would be that there is a granular date object that means the bag of granular things. So in other words, one could take, given any date object that has granularity, one could in principle resolve that date object into the collection of granular objects that it contains.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's a bit like the difference between interval from 1 to 3 and span 1 to 3. So span is just the integers, while the interval is all the reals. So here we simply...
Maybe we should call it date span.
Yeah, we were kind of thinking about that. And then do we just have the default date span be instant to instant, or is there a meaningful reason to have both the date interval and date span? And I think probably not.
Yeah, well, I mean, so the default would be to take the granularities of the two endpoints, right? If those granularities agree, then you have it made, I claim.
Mm-hmm.
And then you default to that. Now, what if the granularities don't agree?
So generally, our precedent has been for things like date range, where you can give a start date and end date, is we implicitly assume that the granularity is the granularity of the starting date. And we go out through the end of the granularity of the end date.
Okay.
So
that's not stupid. I think that's a quite sensible way to do it. I mean, I think it gets very weird if the end date. Okay, but so in date span, for example, it's going to be hard to understand. So date range. If I say date range of today, today. What do I say? Today plus 5 days, for example. Okay, magnificent. So those are so in other words, what we could imagine is date range of a date span.
Yeah, so for comparison, if you do date range of today, next date month, the second one is a month granular object. And the two ways we can interpret that are either...
Why didn't that autocomplete?
We have an open ticket on that we're looking at with Tom.
Okay.
So in this case, you get all of the dates in June as well, because you specified a month granular object. So we're not stopping at the beginning of June, we're going through the end of June. And I think
so a month, I see. Next date will now give me June in that case.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so date interval or date span. I'm a little concerned about date span. I think date interval may be clearer than date span.
Yeah, I guess the other concern is when we call it date interval, then we need to follow the precedent of interval fairly closely, I would think. And I don't know that there's a strong case for multi-intervals of dates at the moment. And the way that interval handles the rounding out of the endpoints to handle machine epsilon is also a little different than what we necessarily want for dates.
Why?
Well, just in terms of the the notion of how we want to handle open versus closed in dates.
Yeah, I know, but we're going to have the same issue of is this before that and so on. The same issue is on the number line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I don't see why it should be any different from that. Now the question is whether it needs the extra level of list bracket. Because interval, how does interval work? Interval has some.
Yeah, it has a list of mins and maxes.
That's kind of stupid. Well, 1996, not probably the best decision.
Ideally, with dates, we would have something that is closed on the left and open on the right so that we can partition exactly the time axis without overlapping.
I see. Well, okay, so the multi-interval concept. I mean, I can see that being useful for dates. Every Tuesday becomes a date interval of a bunch of Tuesdays. Right? I mean, it's a multi-interval. How else are we going to represent that? I mean, we could imagine having those min-maxes could be potentially single date objects with granularity.
Mm-hmm. Right. As a convenience right now, date interval, if you give it so it follows the current syntax of interval where it's expecting a start date and an end date. But if you just give it a granular date, it will automatically round it out to its endpoints.
Okay, fine. Well, then I think it's perfectly reasonable to say date interval and have that be something that can be an every Tuesday type thing.
Well, I think date interval is going to be like the non-expanded representation of things. If we want to expand like to very many days, then we will have the concept of date array, which is the efficient way of packing tons of dates.
Okay, but listen, one of the other things we need is every Tuesday from now until the end of the year. Right? How do we represent that?
Right.
Let me make another comment, actually. One of the things that drives me absolutely bonkers with the calendar system, with our calendar system, is a recurring meeting is forever. Like really, really forever. Like I've had recurring meetings that have been going for like several years, and then we change it. And the thing just is extending out, into the next century. And that's really annoying. And I think that they just don't have a good representation for, repeating things that don't repeat forever. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
So what is our idea for how to do that?
We were planning on having some sort of general language for date selections and having a date select that you would accept various ways of specifying periodicities, etc. But then at the end, once we expand it, when we resolve it into something large, potentially very many dates, our idea is to have a data array, similar to quantity array, etc.
Why do we need that? I mean, unless we're going all the way back to the dinosaur day. Does anybody not know? The calendar is hard to extend back to then, given that there's now evidence that one knows the precise day, the asteroid arrived type thing. But unless we're going all the way back to that, when are we ever going to have enough dates that anybody's going to care?
Well, we might need it for, I don't know, time series, and we have thousands of points, and we want to manipulate all the points, all the dates fast.
I see. So that's when you have a lot of date instance rather than date dates.
Yeah.
So it's more like time. I mean, are we imagining that there's a time interval as well as a date interval?
Not in principle. It should be enough to have.
Are you sure?
It will be easy to construct based on the other one, but I don't think, Nick, we have ever talked about time interval.
Not really. I mean, time object is it's kind of a subset of the notion we've had of either headless dates or recurring dates where, we're chopping off sort of the higher order elements of a calendar. And
I claim we're going to need some kind of notion of time interval. I claim that's going to be useful.
Yeah. I guess the other question about calling a date interval is that I guess it isn't really, span sort of has a notion where we could put granularity in the elements, and interval doesn't really, especially if we're going to allow multi-intervals, there's not necessarily an argument.
Well, so your proposal is that the multi thing is handled in some different way. Is that right? I think we should have some idea of how we're going to do this multi thing before we lock in on this design. Mm-hmm. But I think that, okay, so the question is, if it was date span, date span, yeah, it suggests granular stuff to me.
Right. Which is more general, so it's perhaps better.
Well, so then what you imagine for date span is the same thing as span, where you're doing the initial, the final, the step, right?
Right, so this would have a beginning, end, and granularity. So effectively the same arguments of date object, but the first one is a pair, beginning, end.
Well, is it a pair with the list, or is it begin, end, granularity? I think it has to be like that. Date span, begin, end, granularity.
Yeah, that'd be consistent with span's notation or span's argument structure.
Okay, but then what would happen? Okay, so if you give date span a single date object, then what that would mean is the whole of it, so to speak. See, another question is, so if you regranularize, so if I say date object of now, comma, minutes. Okay, so that's now been granularized. That's now that is a specific minute.
Yes.
But so now what I want to do is I want to regranularize a day into a date span, which is the sequence of its minutes. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Also, span has this argument of the step or increment. I don't know how would that translate to date span.
Well, I mean, we're imagining using that as granularity, but I'm afraid I think it's a little different.
Right, because you might want the first minute,
Yeah, I mean, I'm beginning to think this is not going to work here. Mac, or however it's said on our live stream, is pointing out that iCal has a good recurrence grammar. Well, it sure doesn't get used in the Zimbra implementation. I think we've looked at that in the past, but we should look at that again. I mean, we've also got a representation of this in scheduled task, right?
Yeah, scheduled task has it also has a reference to cron notation, since that's used pretty often in scheduling.
Right.
But yeah, we have the general string versions of those, of hourly, daily, etc.
Sure, but the cron version. Okay, so this is another analogy here. But let's come back to, I'm beginning to cool on the date span idea, because I think that's, again, well, we've got the notion of date range, which will actually enumerate for you the dates, right?
Correct.
I mean, I'm really beginning to think date interval is what it's about, because it's a date interval, but I don't know how we deal with granularity then.
Well, I guess that would be the alternate approach, would be that the granularity is something that is relevant to whatever function is operating on it.
I don't like it. The only reason we're doing that is because we have a Farog's interval.
I would say, again, we imitate date object. It's just that the first argument is a pair.
Say that again, sorry?
We imitate date object, but the first argument is a pair, beginning, end.
Yeah, I understand, but the problem with that is that then we don't have the Farog's behavior of interval. Well, what about the possibility of having date object take a list as its first argument?
Well, it already takes date lists. So we wouldn't be able to specify dates in other formats other than date object itself.
And I wouldn't interpret that as an interval, but maybe as a list of dates. That would be an extension of that one, not as an interval. That would be confusing.
Right.
I'm not thrilled about the idea of having an interval with a different. I mean, so the argument would be, do an interval with begin end, and a granularity argument there.
Yeah, and I mean, if we want to have numeric begin and end, then we can have calendars and as a third argument, etc.
Okay. But okay, so then if we're doing that, we're blowing away the multi-interval version, which might be okay because we might have another way of doing the union of date intervals.
Perhaps here we add a new list, so it could be a single pair or a list of pairs.
That's grotesquely incompatible with interval.
Yes, but in date interval, we need additional arguments.
No, I understand. All right, well, so that, but at least we could start off with this concept. Now, let's take a look at what you're talking about here. So a date interval, that defines the granularity of objects inside the interval, right? The granularity of where so for example, that could be the first day of the month, the last day of the month, and that's minutes. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'd be the
that would represent every minute in that interval. Okay.
Without having to list them. Yeah.
Right. Right. And so then, among other things, date range of a date interval should resolve it.
It could. I mean, right now, range of interval doesn't expand the interval.
And nor should it, because the interval there doesn't have granularity.
Yeah, I think if we do sort of have this notation break with traditional interval, then we have a stronger case for being able to use date interval as a start end.
That could be made to work. That might be an interesting thing to make work. I mean, I've never really needed it, but it might be an interesting thing to make work.
Well, it can be applied.
Yeah, it could be applied. Okay, but then this, all right, so what's the other case here? Let's just look at this.
So one of the questions is about instantiation of the intervals. So our central dogma with granular dates is that if you have a function that needs a specific instant and it's operating on a date object with a granularity larger than an instant, it takes the first applicable moment. So if I have this year and I feed it into, air temperature data and it says I need a specific instant, it will get the first moment of this year.
But it doesn't necessarily need an instant. It can give a time series.
I guess, air temperature data is a bad example here.
Let's try it. Okay, so air temperature data of today, for example, I'm predicting should give a time series. Well, what is it? That's not right. Why didn't it give a time series?
I think Jason was looking at that.
Okay, so if I say of, last month, is that going to give a date object correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not
by the way, what that did, it wasn't very beautiful and should probably be fixed. What the heck?
Oh, right. Right. So this is the notion that it's giving an interval because you entered in a single date, and so we wanted to give back out a single value corresponding to the granularity.
Okay, but so how would I get the time series for today? I know that if I do a time series, if I do something like yesterday, today, then I'll get the time series. But now what time series does that go up to? That goes up to but what the heck? That's going up to the beginning of today. which is arguably not what it should be doing.
Mm. Yeah, I think, Jose, you might remember, I remember we had a conversation with Jason about this, and I believe our notion was that if to give something like the time series back, we were expecting to have an input like a date interval, and we don't have that at the moment. But the idea would be if if I put in a single date object, then I should get a single value back. But if I put a date interval in, then I would automatically get the time series value back because I have a start date and an end date and potentially a sampling size.
No, that doesn't seem unreasonable. So in other words, it would be air temperature data of date interval of today.
Mm-hmm.
And you could potentially give a sampling of hours, for instance, and then that could return intervals for each hour, or it could return, actual values.
Right. Yes. So that's the idea, that a date object is always a discrete single object, and an interval is a collection of them. So it's.
So what time does that say it's for? I mean, when is that for?
I don't know how it's computed, but it's either an average or I don't know the resolution with which we get the data.
15 minutes.
15 minutes. So it's perhaps an average.
Okay. But so air temperature data may have an aggregator for that.
Right.
Okay, so let's just summarize where we're at here. We've got date range would resolve things. Date interval has a begin, end, and a granularity. The granularity represents, so what it represents is the range of things from beginning to end with that internal granularity, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And then I think the formatting should be I would recommend something like the following. So just like it would say, well, if the granularity is the same as, so it would say something like whole day, colon, blah, 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 blah. See what I'm saying? To represent the interval.
Mm-hmm.
That represents the interval from beginning to end, but that's with, well, let's see. I mean, the other thing we might do is each minute in, or every minute in. What do you think? I mean, that's to represent what it means.
If I have this entire year and the granularity is minute.
Or for example, in another case, it would be every day in, well, it might even say in year 1960, but it could just say, go ahead, what were you going to say?
The general case is a case having different beginning and end. So I think what they should do is to have the most common case, like from 5th to 6th of May, or from May 5th to June 6th of this year.
Right. So, okay. So then you're saying you factor out the year here.
Exactly. In that case, it's common. And January.
Right. So, and I don't even understand how that negative interval works there. But let's say 27 to 28 through 28. January 2019, for example.
Right.
And maybe the through, yeah, like you do there with lighter color.
Yeah. And then our worst case scenario is basically two instants that don't have, it's from 37 seconds past the hour of this until blah. And then we may have the full typeset form look like it currently does in external.
Okay, so if the granularity disagrees with the implied granularity of these things here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then we would say something like every minute in 27 through 28 January 2019. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that should be pretty easy to detect.
Okay. All right. By the way, where am I saving this stuff? Anybody know? Do I have a historical data? Here we go. Yeah, I'm just going to do SW notes too. Okay, let's now. I think we have everybody else here, so let's go ahead and start talking about the other stuff. If we're done with the data interval discussion.
Yeah, I think that should be enough for me to get started.
Okay, great. Okay, times, polygons, and date intervals in time series. Okay.
Well, as we previously spoke on the meetings before about historical booklets, we checked. We had currently we return a list of dates and polygons, and what was suggested to use this to work this as a time series, which we have already been working on and made a time series to work for that.
Okay, well, hold on. Okay, so this is polygon time series, and so what you're saying is, if I were to enter, to simplify this a bit, if I were to enter, so that's the entity, and if I were to enter this, just to be clear, that I should be able to say here, dated of polygon, comma, all, correct?
Okay, that should return a list right now.
Okay, but that's incompatible with other uses of that. I mean, if I say, for instance, this is taking it a while, but and also we have to do better caching for this, right? Okay, well, that's magnificent. Okay, well, so first of all, so there are many bugs here. I mean, these should be data objects, granular data objects of some kind, right? Or actually, in the case of historical countries, they should presumably be data intervals. Am I right?
We are still well we have a pull request on the review in order to treat this as a time series. So we are doing this with an interpolation order, with a sampling method of interpolation with a hold from left. So we just have the endpoint, the start point, and then we go until the next step of this time series.
Okay. So you'll get a time series, and then that's fine. But in general, the time series should have data objects rather than these raw. I mean, it doesn't really matter. It can deal with date lists, but so what it's implicitly doing then. Okay, well, I think that's look. It's the right thing to make this a time series, right?
Correct.
Okay, so then.
But by the way, we choose this format initially because that was compatible with the day list step plot functions and that kind of plot functions.
What functions?
So the plot functions already work with pairs of date list plus a value.
So what happens if I say to this date list plot? It's going to be garbage, right?
No, because the value is a polygon. But if you have the area, for example, there instead of the, it will work.
So let's imagine what I do here is I say, if I take #1, geo area of #2, and I do that on this, right? Is that going to work? Coolosaurus. Let's see. Okay. Now, the only issue with that is that it does the incorrect holding, right? In other words, it's interpolating between, it's like poor whoever it was, Caesar, when he conquered Gaul or something, it'll show, this will be very, this will interpolate Caesar's, trip across Gaul, which is undoubtedly not correct. Whereas what we have is discrete points where we know, that things happened, and we make the approximation that things only happen when we knew they happened. Am I making sense?
Right. That's why we show this with the step plot instead of the regular list plot, which is a simple interpolation.
So what are you saying? Is it like this? Okay. But that will happen automatically if this thing is constructed into a time series, correct? Because the time series will have the hold from left attribute set, right?
Right.
Okay. Now, another question I have, if we have geo list plot, do we need any kind of geo date list plot? Wouldn't that be a good thing to have? I mean, couldn't we, what would it do? I mean, you could imagine something which has some kind of contours or something. Okay, is there anything meaningful for it to do? If you were animating, there's something to do, but otherwise, is there something meaningful for it to do?
Yes, I think the question will be what we will do with a time series as input for plot functions, for geoplot plot functions in general.
Sorry, you're saying we have to figure that out, or you have an idea?
No. My only idea will be to actually get the values and plot them all together, but we will need some kind of shading or different way to show
Yeah,
them.
well, so I mean, I think the obvious thing to do would be to stack them on top of each other and to have essentially an opacity, and the more the thing has been there, the darker it gets. I don't know if anybody can think of a better idea.
I think I agree with that. Perhaps with some tooltip or something like that for the years.
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, in other words, so like a contour plot gives the levels, this is effectively giving, I mean, what this is a density plot. It's a little bit of a weird thing. I mean, if we do this for geo, we probably should be able to do this for just a collection of polygons in a time series. I mean, it seems more useful for the geo case, but you get what I'm saying. There's nothing that makes this special with respect to geo versus anything else.
Right.
But you could do it by stacking polygons. You could have polygons in a time series as well.
Right.
Now, presumably, we should make things like geo area operating on the time series just work. Operating on a time series of polygons, do the right thing.
I think that already my work operates over the time series itself.
Okay. All right. So what is that to figure out here? So this is
the only issue there is to specify the ending point, because we have this until some year that it's really not specified in this list. So the last polygon is valid until some date.
And that will be specified in the time series object, yeah?
But right now there is no way to specify that. So
surely time series has some way to specify. Well, I mean, do we have that in the data, in the underlying data? I mean,
yes, we know until which date the country existed.
That's 410 AD or something for the Roman Empire, or maybe
for example.
Yeah, I see. But now, okay.
So that's like the domain of the time series. So to have an extra information in the time series.
I thought the time series had that. Or is it the case that time series just look for the last point? Well, I mean, what we would have to do in the current design of time series is replicate the last point, right?
Well, we were thinking about adding a missing as last point. So after that, you will get a missing value.
I see. Missing country doesn't exist. Right?
Right, but I would prefer to have some kind of way to specify the domain at the time series level.
Well, okay, but that's a time series question. Is anybody from the time series team here?
Yes.
Okay, can you comment on that? Is that Gosha? I couldn't tell from the.
No, because you provide the timestamps, and so this is a collection of pairs, time value pairs, and so we don't specify the domain, because you don't have, the domain is specified by the first time and last time.
Yeah, I know, I understand. But the problem is that
that's how this is
from
defined.
left. Right, but in the hold from left story, where is hold from left? Is hold from left part of the resampling method?
Yes.
Right, but so the issue these guys have is they're doing hold from left, and then they need an endpoint. If you're doing interpolation, you don't need an endpoint because there's no place to go other than an anchor point that's there out at the end.
Right, but the suggestion that they made that they know the end, the end of the end point after which there is nothing, and they can put the missing.
Okay, but who's okay? But Francisco is asking for an actual domain. Okay, what happens if you say duration of the time? I mean, in the case where there's a thing with a missing at the end, the duration of the time series would give the correct value, would it not?
No, it's gonna give you the span of the timestamps.
I understand that, but so what?
It's independent of the. In the way, it's independent of the values because it's giving you the information.
I know. So it will give the right thing. So I mean, let me edit my Roman Empire. I'm gonna take only the late Roman Empire here, okay? And then I'm going to do this, and then what we're saying is, it says next. When did Rome fall? Was it 410 AD? Did I remember that correctly? Then it would look like that. Is that correct? Okay, so now my question to you, Gosha, is if I ask for duration of this time, so let's say I make this into a time series, okay? Let's actually do it. Okay, and now I say duration of that time series. Oh, for God's sake, that is a stupid unit. We should be doing a better job of why on earth does it do that? It should be giving years here. Well, that's a separate issue, that it should be inheriting the granularity of the date objects. Do you get what I'm saying?
Well, that's on to-do list because right now it's not.
Okay, well, I'm fine. Yeah. It should be. Okay, but in any case, so that is 410 minus 272 times 365, yes? Is that right? Is that what it computed? Well,
yeah, the problem is that it's not considering the full year of 410.
No, it's got leap years and everything in there, right?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
So it's right. So it did compute the right thing. Okay, so let's be clear. This will give the right answer. If we go to the last point here and we say after that point it's missing, then so far as we know, that will compute all the right things. Correct?
Yeah, the only issue with that schema right now is, I think that if you do values of that time series, you're going to get the missing also. That's the only
Tough luck. If you do values of the time series, you're going to get garbage because you're going to see, you're going to see it independent of dates, and then who knows what you get. I mean, in other words, the issue here, I mean, it's a closed versus open interval issue.
Right, but if you want to compute things, you should be able to use delete missing and then compute. But then also gives you the idea where the things end. So if you ask for the, for the time series at the date 500, it's gonna give you missing because it's gonna interpolate from the last, hold from the left. So if you
what will it do if you ask for a time series, but I mean the value for 100 AD here? It's not going to do something stupid, is it, where it gives that value? Because it needs to really have a missing, a pre-missing as well.
Missing. It's going to extrapolate.
Well, it can't do that. Sorry, it can't do that. So that's why these guys are asking for a domain for the time series. Because it absolutely cannot do that. And by the way, are there any cases, and I can imagine for some historical things, that the thing is happily humming along, and then there is a missing period in the middle, and then it goes back and hums along again? Right?
Yes.
Okay, so how do we represent that? Because this isn't going to cut it to have, yeah. So what do you want to do for that?
Well, if you know which date it stopped existing, you can also put the
No, I understand that. Let's assume that this is the start date. Okay? Let's take a look. I don't really know I don't know my Roman, I don't know who that Was that Augustus or something? I don't know what that was. Anybody know Roman history well enough to know? Anyway, let's imagine, there was some start date like 700 BC or something for the Romulus and Remus or whatever it was. And that's probably a fuzzy start date, but there is a definite start date. And it better not be the case that if I ask for the Roman Empire before 27 BC, that I get, it should just say missing, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So how are we going to do that? Gosha? What do we put into the time series to get that to work?
Well, you need to, in that case, that would be the missing, again, information.
No. Look, we're agreeing that we could do a hold from left idea where we put a missing at the end to represent when the thing goes out of existence. But, well, okay, so you could argue that the convention is bad here. Oh, gosh, this is a mess. Look, the point is that we've got one piece of information that's missing from this picture here, which is what the end date was. We've got the start date, but we don't have the end date, right? Which is unfortunate and asymmetric. So the truth is, the way this should be represented is this is wrong, and that's why we're getting into trouble. The correct way to do this is to have a time series of intervals. Right, of date intervals. Because if we said date interval from 27 to blah, 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 you get this. From 389 to 410, you get this. Then we'd be in good shape.
And then we just have some sort of strict endpoint rule that says if you ask outside either of the endpoints, it's considered an invalid query.
That's right. And by the way, Sandra on a live stream is talking about why don't we have an interpolation and extrapolation separately? But I don't think that's right, because the country could have had, there could be time series where it's missing in the middle. So I think what we have to have is something where there are a series of intervals, and the way those intervals are set up, they knit together so that they form a continuum when combined. But if you land in your probe somewhere other than on an interval, it says missing. Because that's the nature of our data. The data says from minus 27 BC to minus 19 BC, the area of the Roman Empire was blah, and then on from there. This is the right way to do it.
So that would be really the event series when we would allow the timestamps there to have this spread in time, because the event series by default does not interpolate in between the timestamp.
But maybe that's right then.
Maybe that's the way, because the time series, by default is to interpolate. That's the purpose in life. And this, when we talk about this is really the event series you want the missing when the things are not.
Okay, so let's take a look at something else. So this is really a moment of, we really have to understand what a notion of history here, because if I do the following, if I say something like New York City, and then I say dated population, all, I am going to get a time series, right? And if I say date list plot, it is going to, look at that, it's going to join the points, right? So if I say date list plot %22, mesh arrow all, okay, it joined the points. Now, for population, we think that's reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, that is really wild, because for area, which we probably do you think we have the area of New York City? We might.
Not as a historical time series.
Okay, but let's imagine that we did. Then it's almost certainly wrong to do this joining up business.
Mm-hmm.
That is quite subtle. So for what characteristics, it's kind of like, boy, how would we distinguish properties that are plausibly joined up from properties that are not plausibly joined up? I mean, things that are determined by regulation or by conquest are probably not joined up. But for example, in early times in history, before there were clear borders, it could be that the area changes continuously. some random nomadic tribe is wandering out into the steppe somewhere.
But in case the state did not exist, so it didn't make sense to talk about.
Well, that's not true. Back in early, anybody know a really early, well, let's try Ur. Is Ur a considered an early civilization?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
It's
let's do it.
Yes.
Well, I know that, but I'm just wondering whether Ur made it on its own as a city-state. Okay, Ur made it as a city-state. So let's just do a geolist plot of Ur. Oh, that is really wild. Wow. What do you think those puppies are?
Different.
Well, yes, obviously. Okay, well, I wonder what... Okay, so first question is, what year did it pick for this? I think it picks the maximum extent, doesn't it?
Right.
Okay.
Right now, as default polygon, we return the...
Now, the good news is we have a polygon with holes here, which is very high-tech. But, okay, so clearly, okay, this is a bad example. But I could imagine an example, I don't know, maybe there's something in, I don't know where, Africa maybe, I don't know, one of the early things there, where you really just have something which is expanding into a vacuum, right? So it would make sense to have continuous expansion. Let's, how do we get the earliest date here? Okay, so if I say geolist plot, geolist plot dated Ur, oh my gosh, why is this beeping? Crazy. Okay, 2700 BC. Oh, for goodness sake, what did it do there? Why does it not have a series for... Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yes.
Come on.
Okay, so we have polygons from the 2047 BC.
Okay, well, why did this not work? Okay, well, whatever the start date is, we better have some polygons going back to the start date. Okay, so let's go back. So what are you saying? So if I say 1900 BC, for example, I might finally... What the heck? Come on, what's going on here? There's something famous, right? When was the Rhine papyrus was a different civilization, but that was... What is going on here? Help, where did Ur go? Did Ur disappear by that time? Okay, somebody is suggesting on the live stream the growth of the US. That is a good idea. So if I say USA, and now I say like 1820. When was the Louisiana?
No, because we still have this bifurcation between country and historical country.
Okay, so what can we do there? So how do we do historical
Francisco,
US?
Rodrigo, they're not exposed linguistically, but don't we have countries still in historical country?
Yes, it's also in the historical country, but we are not exposing them.
In the what?
With any linguistics.
So wait a minute. So what should happen here? This should give an assuming to allow for a historical country, correct? How should this work? I mean, look, if you do dated, this thing should evaluate to the historical country.
Yes, the one idea was to actually redirect the polygons to the historical countries polygons in country data. Right. That's I think probably.
Can you tell me what the historical country of the US is?
I think it's also United States, but let me verify that.
Okay, but it's not exposed linguistically. All right. And that's really weird because it doesn't say, okay, fine. All right, so let's put this in. I mean, this is where I get upset about the fact that we've gone to all this work to get all this data. Okay, what's going on here? Okay, so now let's try doing it, the range to be the modern US. What does that mean?
I think you should try geographics. I think your list plot is not taking data properly.
Okay, so that's probably a bug. Okay, what's happening here?
You need a
Where is-
polygon.
I need a polygon wrapper there. Okay, look, the difficulty of doing this is okay, cool. All right, so now the question is, I don't know my history well enough. The people who are going out on this frontier, right? Is this something where if I look at this for 1825, for example, it will presumably have expanded a bit, like you can see that border there changed, right? So could you type on mute, please? So the question is that a case where it is more plausible that we should interpolate, or should we again only do it in a granular way? I have no idea what was happening here. Anybody want to comment on this? I don't know the history for this particular case, but
I think we should assume always the granular steps, because we
okay. So look, okay, for population, for example, it is much more sensible to try interpolating, even though that might in principle be wrong. You know, this is a much more sensible plot than if we said date list step plot. I mean, we could do this, but I think it's the wrong thing to do, because I think it's better to, we get a better estimate of the population by doing the interpolation than we do by doing steps. Making sense? I think this is a silly thing to do. And I think we'll also get crazy stuff, like if you try and work out the growth rate, it'll go crazy if you're doing it with steps, right? But we then have to curate which properties we think we can interpolate and which we cannot.
But this perhaps doesn't depend so much on the property. It's truly in the history of the thing, because when the US bought the Louisiana, they bought very much space, and I guess a lot of population as well.
You are right.
So it would just depend on the history, and the user needs to know what to use.
All right, so let's consider the Louisiana purchase, so to speak, and consider the population data for the US, right? Boy, that's a mess. Because that's saying that there's a time series where effectively we have continuous interpolation and then we have a spike. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Now, how do we represent that in the time series? Go show.
We don't.
So let's figure out how to do it.
Because one thing is to have the timestamps very close. You would introduce.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I understand. Well, that's a possibility. 2 timestamps effectively on top of each other.
Almost, yes. Mm-hmm.
Now here, if we specify instants, we are not saying what happens in between, and there is where interpolation is important. But if we specify intervals, then we are saying we are specifying that we assume it stays constant during that interval, and then we don't need to say anything about.
That's a fair point. Yeah, that's a fair point. Now the question is, could we have a time series where we mix those 2 things?
Not at the moment.
No, I understand that, but that seems like a reasonable way to go with this. I mean, history is complicated, and I think this. All right, so look, provisionally, that's a way to go. But we've had other problems here, like this whole business with the, well, okay, so we've got some bugs with dated, but we've also got to deal with this problem of, if we say dated of United States, dated of the current entity United States, 1820, that's got to do something reasonable. Am I making sense? What are we going to have that do?
This also ties back into the other conversation we've been having about entities and ontologies, and the fact that the set of entities that apply at any given point of time can change. I have never really liked the fact that we have country and historical country. Whereas as countries cease to be, they have to move into this other entity type.
What do you mean? I mean, the problem is that countries, it's somebody, some dictator takes over somewhere and they rename their country the Democratic Republic of the whatever.
Sure.
Right, and then
all these things were countries when they existed, and they are still countries. They're just countries that don't exist anymore. It's the historical XXX prefix that I'm not crazy about, because it seems like a convenience for us to just call one entity type to get a list of current countries.
Hold on.
The most recent case, for example, that we have a country disappearing is Sudan. I think split. We still keep the main one as Sudan, because they keep like this main.
Sudan, I mean, it's just very weird because, in a change of control, so to speak, like, here's a piece of history I don't know. When Cromwell took over in England in the English Civil War, did they rename the country? Probably not, because the country didn't happen to have, something designating monarchy in its name. But during the French Revolution, did they rename France? Anybody know? I mean, certainly there have been plenty of countries renamed. Maybe some South American knows of. Wasn't Venezuela renamed at some point?
Yeah, but usually we take these renames as the official name renaming. So the way people call Venezuela is to Venezuela, even when they call officially República Bolivariana de Venezuela. So
wait. But what counts as a new country then? So wait a minute. You're saying Venezuela can stay Venezuela, but it changes its name. Is that right?
Right.
Yes, the same happened in Poland after communism fell. It formally changed the name, but still it was the same Poland, when you think about it.
Well, wait a minute. I mean, okay, that was true for that, but I mean, if you take, I don't know, Ukraine, for example, that was simply part of the Soviet Union, right?
Yes. It was a part of it was like a state in the Soviet Union, and then it became its own country. Yes.
Right, but so in that case, okay, so let me just clarify what we're saying here. So, boy, this is a mess. Okay, do we think we have okay, so you're claiming that, but Sudan is not such a case, because Sudan is actually split, or Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, split into multiple countries, right?
Yeah, so we moved Yugoslavia so Yugoslavia only exists right now in historical country, for example. That's right. And we have in country data as country entities, the split parts.
Okay, fine, I understand. Okay, so what is Alan proposing?
I'm not sure what I'm proposing, and just this is a separate issue that came up in another meeting, and if we're thinking about the right way to do things, I thought it's worth asking whether this is the right way to do things.
So in other words, you're saying we could imagine an Uber entity type that is country sometime, basically.
Right.
And then that there is a different entity type, which is current countries.
Perhaps. Or there's a property that says whether something is currently extant or whether it's defunct.
Well, but I think this is the same issue as there's an entity type that talks about mammals, and there's an entity type for general species.
Sure.
And I mean, to say country sometime, I think that's going to get really weird as well. I mean, I think there's no great solution to this because I think that this history is just kind of messy. But the issue right now, one thing that's clear is that dated of US, 1820, better do something reasonable. Now, okay, question. If I say dated of Roman Empire, minus 100, 100 BC, what should that do? In other words, why was the Roman Republic going to the Roman Empire not just a rename, like Venezuela? Why was it a new country? What makes something a new country as opposed to a rename?
That's an interesting, more a conceptual question, I think. And for example, we have the case of Germany, where we have a different historical entity for the Germany after 1990, or the Germanies when they were split, or the Nazi Germany. So we have many Germanies, for example, in a historical country, instead of having one.
Wait. Those are many different things, right? Because East Germany, West Germany, versus, I mean, and now I'm going to show my ignorance of history, but weren't the borders of Nazi Germany comparable to the borders of current unified Germany? I mean, in other words, that.
No, because they had Anschluss and then they attacked other countries, and it was.
Well, but that was after. But that was after they started walking into other countries. But prior to 1933 or something, didn't they have a? I guess. Okay, Germany before 90. Well, we can just look it up, right? We can just do this. Presumably, we have a historical country. Do we have a historical country, Germany?
Nazi Germany, we have, yes.
No. What about pre that? What about in 1930?
Weimar Republic.
So it would count. We would consider it as Weimar Republic.
I think so. I don't know.
So in other words, it wasn't Germany. So let's say 1931, for example, and that's a bad geo range to use. You were right. Okay. So fair enough. So its borders were comparable but not the same. Okay. Now tell me the difference. Okay, but we are choosing to make this so dated of Germany, dated of Germany, 1931. What do we think that should do?
I have a suggestion. So we could have that dated of country always goes to historical country. It just has to decide which of the historical country entities is the most interesting one. And then we would have to have the current countries inserted into historical country.
Yes, all the current countries are already in historical country. So that's already done. And yes,
the current countries with border changes are in historical country. Is that true? Yeah, like we just saw for the US.
Right.
Yes. And also there is a proposal about so we already have the information in historical country about what could be considered the successor entity, let's say.
Excellent. Okay, what's the successor entity to Ur?
Not all the entities might have a successor entity, of course. But I can take a look of.
Well, I mean, it could be Iraq. I mean, I don't know. I mean, one way to imagine a successor entity is to ask. I mean, obviously, we have some overlapping. Go ahead. What were we going to say?
So successor means one or the most current. So it would be some.
No.
It's a property that let us have the chain. For example, German Empire with Weimar Republic, with Nazi Germany with Germany. That will be the chain for Germany, for example. Or
so it's a connection. I see.
Right, but for example, I'm not sure if we could consider the Roman Empire part of the Italy predecessors. so it's not exactly the same. That's
what breaks the chain of successorhood.
I think that's probably more for historical people to think about that. break. But for now, I think we
Could
were
we
considering.
can we get a visualization at some point of just what all the chains look like? And then,
Yes, we could generate that, of course.
okay. I mean, I think that seems fairly non-silly. I mean, so the question is whether dated of Italy, comma, 100 AD, what that should do. And I think nobody would reasonably expect that to give you, the Roman Empire.
What are you saying? You'd expect it to sort of look through the chain of success. Well, but I mean, to look through that chain of succession to see if there was a precursor or successor country that had data in the requested date and return that, and otherwise it fails.
Right. Well, see, this is where it's complicated, and is like Greece, for example. Greece, I think, would like to trace itself back to, I don't know what, the Athenians and the whatever it is. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I mean, there are countries that want to trace themselves back a long way, whereas Italy, I don't think, would claim the Roman Empire as a predecessor. Maybe it would. Maybe the Vatican would claim the Roman Empire as a predecessor. I don't know. Anybody have an opinion about it? Do we have history people on this call?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Do you have an opinion about this?
It actually depends on how do they define the nation and what's well, it's quite a gray area, as you already have told. So we can track this back as well, as Francisco said. We can trace Germany back all the way to the Weimar Republic, or maybe the German Empire that was before that. But we cannot track that down to maybe the Saxons or the German tribes.
Right. So there was that. I mean, right before it was unified, it's tough to go back. I mean,
but for example, there was what was this Holy Roman Empire of a German nation, which considered itself the continuation of the Roman Empire, which was not.
What about the Western?
Equally, right. So it is all over the place in a way. Because you may think about this politically. So what people consider themselves as a continuation, but also you may think geographically, which country occupied this region in a way, and then it transformed to something else.
Right. Well, so look, basically this is a curation story. I mean, basically there are things that people reasonably consider to be ancestral countries and so on, and ones where they don't. And it's going to be a bit arbitrary, but I think there's a like I would think, what's a good example? I mean, the US generally considers that it simply didn't exist before it. I mean, it doesn't say the origin was some, American Indian tribe somewhere. It says it didn't exist. Whereas, and again, that's a mess, because obviously it's a different, it's folks from a different part of the world. Gosh, that's a weird. Maybe that's a weird. I don't know if that's a weird case or not. What about the Vikings? Invading the north of England? I don't think they thought that was a different country. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know. With King Canute and all those guys. Well, I think so. Look, sounds to me like it's a curation story, that we basically just have to decide for every current country, what we think it's reasonable. Yeah, I think this is the right way to do it. The first step is take every current country and ask what its reasonable predecessors were. But sometimes it's going to get really wacky, because, like, for instance, I don't, and piece of history I don't know, but like the British Empire, for example, when it had an island somewhere, I don't think that island was ever a nation. Before, something like, some country in Africa, like, I don't know, I don't know, let's say Nigeria or something, which I think was, I don't know that one for sure, but like Zimbabwe, what used to be Rhodesia, Zimbabwe now? I don't know. That you probably, my pieces of history, is that the wrong country? But I think there were distinct countries. They just were part of the British Empire. But then there are other places where there was a piece of land. Actually, I think the British had some very elaborate way of distinguishing these things. That, you know, when there was a piece of land that was just directly. Okay, anybody know this history?
So I know, you know, like for example, the Congo, prior to being a Dutch colony, was actually private property of King, what's his name? I'm blanking on it, but you know, prior
Leopold,
to that,
maybe?
yeah,
Leopold
King
II of
yeah.
Belgium.
Yeah.
Yeah, so before it was a territory of Belgium, it was his personal property. He just said, this entire geostate is mine. And prior to that, it was a collection of tribes.
Okay, so where do we go with that? I mean, my basic point would be, go back, take the current country, and ask, you know, what are the reasonable predecessor countries? The case where I think it's awkward is where something was taken over as a piece of some empire and was not, well, like the case of Ukraine during the Soviet period. What do you do there? So the predecessor of Ukraine is surely not the Soviet Union, because that will give really goofy stuff.
So then perhaps we need two conditions: that is of reasonable, of similar size and of similar name.
Oh, gosh. Okay, but then what happens? Then what happens to Ukraine? Does it disappear during the Soviet period and then reappear as you go before, whenever it was taken over, 1917-ish?
Yeah, somehow that might be something we need to do because, well, we don't have historical territories, let's say. Because, for example, you have the colonies, all the Spanish colonies in South America, for example. Some were countries or some kind of nation before or not, but during the time they were part of the Spanish Empire, then they became independent countries. So they disappear as sovereign nations somehow. So that's,
but you know, the expectation is that administrative divisions, if you look at beyond ADM 0, if you look down to ADM 1s and ADM 2s and things, that you will see more continuity. Is that the claim? But that it may pop up and down. Like, it's unlikely that Ukraine just disappeared. It didn't. You know, during the Soviet period, it was merely a part of the Soviet Union, as opposed to
right, an administrative division, let's say.
Right.
Right, but the example is Poland disappeared for over 100 years. It was split into 3 countries, for example. If you're looking for disappearance and reappearance.
Okay, so much for that theory.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, this is oh my gosh, this is such a mess. Okay, well, now we have a number of interesting comments on the live stream of people with all kinds of pieces of history that I don't know. All right, well, look, it seems to me there is an intuitive sense of predecessor countries which may be rather restricted and may have holes. Like, you would think, Gosha, that in the case of Poland, that it existed, and then you go back in history during the time, I suppose, when it's Prussia and stuff like that, if I'm remembering correctly, it simply didn't exist.
Yes.
But then before that, it existed. Is that true?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then that's what we have to do. I would imagine that if you say dated of Poland, comma, I don't know what we say.
18 whatever, yes.
Right. That what would happen? It would simply say missing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but we then independently want to know, we've already discussed, for a geopoint, we can absolutely know what country, what historical country, if we do a geo-identify of a certain geopoint at a certain date, that we can answer. You know, what was this in 1875 or something?
Yeah, but that will answer, of course, the historical country itself, not the successor.
No, I understand.
I think
That's what I'm saying. But I mean, then the other thing one wants to know. Okay, so here's another way to do that. If we ask geo-identify of a region, like for example Poland, right, of current Poland, and you go back and you roll that back to 1850, then what it should answer is whatever those three countries were that had pieces in what is now Poland, right? See what I'm saying? So in other words, if you want to know the answer to what was Poland in 1850, you do a geo-identify of Poland with dated 1850, and then it returns those three countries. Does that seem right?
Where would you put the date? It wouldn't be around Poland because Poland is the current Poland. It would be around the entity type.
No, I'm saying geo-identify. Okay, so here's what I'm suggesting. Geo-identify, I see what you're saying. Historical country. Yeah, you're right. It's kind of a mess.
Pages of historical country.
Yeah, it's kind of a mess. So we have to say something like this,
Right.
comma, current Poland.
Right.
Well, why is that a mess? I thought that's exactly the scheme that we're working towards.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
And if you wanted to know what countries were in the same, what countries overlapped with Poland as it existed in some other year, then you'd wrap
right.
Poland in a different date. Yeah.
Fair enough. That seems perfectly reasonable. Okay.
You could even admit dated of country of 1850. So the idea is that as soon as you use dated with country, it automatically becomes historical country.
Yes, that's what I think we should do for the time being, at least. I mean, I think that okay, so do I mean geo lookup rather than geo identify? What do I mean there? No, I mean geo identify, right? Yeah. What is this?
So right now, when you have dated in the entity and in the entity type, it takes precedence. So what will happen in entity value calls when you have specified twice the dated? Right now, I think it's taking the one from the property instead of the.
Okay, well, that's obviously wrong. Let's look at some of the things on the live stream here. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, Ben on the live stream says identifying regions for Southern Africa is going to be incredibly difficult since there were fluid kingdom ranges which overlapped with competing colonization forces. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the lie of some of these country borders where you go back and, it wasn't clear what the border of a country meant. And I think, when we have our geostatistics, I think it's just crazy to have like a distribution. I mean, I think we just have to say this is the best shot we've got at defining this. I don't really think there's another way to do it. Now, okay, end up with kingdoms, some of which became their own countries like Swaziland, and others which integrated into nations like Zululand, which is part of South Africa. Restore the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Okay, that's not our problem to solve. To improve the interpreter resolution mechanism, if I want to do. Okay, now what's this? This is okay. So the complaint here is that something about our official names like this don't interpret. Is that true? Do we fail on that? Wow, that's horrifying. So we can't round trip there?
We should.
So if we do Bolivia, oops, and then we say full name or something. Oops, not what I wanted. Okay, but that we probably can round trip, but the problem is we can't round trip. That seems like a curation issue and seems like something we should solve.
Yeah.
Okay, that did fine. All right, I think that's a simple curation issue.
Yeah, I got it. Where did those forms come from? Did somebody just had those from some
Mohammed
other
on the live
source,
stream was commenting
Okay.
on this.
Okay.
Maybe he had it from another source.
Yeah, fine.
That's
we should be able to tweak that to just allow.
I would think so. Those cases.
Variations, yeah.
This whole can of worms. I don't think there's a. I mean, that's just. It's a countries and territories. I mean, that's part of our definition of entity types. Is the fine print says it's a country or it's a territory.
Right, and Antarctica has its own ISO code, etc. So yes, that's why we consider that country data.
Fair enough. Yeah, comments about African borders are obviously incorrect for ethnic types within Africa. Yeah, well, that's the nature of political history. The okay, what is this? This is. Did we already discuss this now? This double dated business.
Yes, that's what I was saying. That right now it's taking into account. So it takes precedence the dated from the property instead of the entity.
Okay, fine. So that's essentially a bug.
Well, the question will be which one should take the precedence in case you have both.
Well, okay. So wait. Why do we need? Okay, so if we have both, let's think about that in this case. What are there other cases where, Alan? Are there other cases where we can distinguish those two? I mean, there are lots of cases,
what
right?
What do we need to distinguish?
Well, okay, so look, there's a dated wrapper that could go around the entity type, the entity, or the property.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the question is, which takes precedence in that situation? I mean, I wouldn't mind generating a message if you have conflicting dateds.
Well, it might default to still use this default, but with an extra message about saying that.
That's fine. I would tend to think, I mean, I can see arguments on both sides for it being the entity that wins versus it being the property that wins. Anybody got any other thoughts on this? I mean, because what I can imagine is code that loops over properties for a whole bunch of entities. I mean, I just don't know.
Well, I think it makes more sense to have what we have right now because actually the one that takes the attribute of the date is the property itself, not the country.
All right, fine. So let's have properties take precedence and generate a message if they conflict. Fair? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, we're really running out of time, but let's see if we can just nail geofunctions on how to treat entities with time series of polygons. Geo within Q. What's wrong with this? That looks wonderful.
It's actually, well, it's the current state that we have for handling geopolygons. Well, handling polygons that have a time series. We can use the geographic functions with those cases because we can retrieve a dated polygon in that time. So we can compare them as regular polygons.
Sounds great to me.
Yes, that's our current state. So right now, our main question would be, okay, so we have these entities that don't return just a polygon, but a time series of polygons. So what are the considerations we have to take when we deal with these kind of cases?
Okay, so wait a minute, but this one, we already have a default because geographics of Roman Empire does something definite, right?
It shows, yes, the full extent, the maximum extent of
Why
the...
does this not work? Can we please make this work? Can we please make geolist plot of a historical country work? Is there a problem with that? Guys? Is there a problem with geolist plot of a historical country working?
No.
So let's make it work.
Yeah.
Please. Okay, so this is the maximum extent. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so...
Well,
yes?
right. So this is the polygon of the Roman Republic that had the maximum extent. So it doesn't cover all the union of all the Roman Republic.
I understand. So which is kind of a hacky thing, but I don't see what else. I mean, I don't know whether there are many countries which have very confusing aspects of that, like where they started off having a big extent to the west, and then they ended up losing that and having a big extent to the east. No idea. Don't
Poland.
know. Okay. Always a good example, apparently.
This is always going to be an answer to your question. We shifted after World War II.
Okay. Interesting. All right. Well, so then, I mean, so if we do, okay, so that, I have no idea what that, can you recognize that? What is that?
That's the current state of affairs.
Okay. Is that the best ever state of affairs, or is there a different one that is...
Well, definitely that's not the best.
So give me a
somewhere
date.
17, try, I don't know, 1650.
Boy, why did that not work?
Well, because we
maybe it wasn't called Poland then.
Because it was probably the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and such. You could try 1490 or something.
Oh boy. Oh, okay. It was called something different then. You know, this is the problem with all of this. I mean, if I say, by the way, linguistically, Poland in 1490, what am I going to get?
You should get Poland because it was already united. We were messed up in 13th century in but...
Okay, so what is that? Can I give that entity instance to the geographic?
Oh no, it was already the Lithuanian Union since 1390. So 1370.
Okay, fine. I'm glad you were paying attention in school when they were teaching.
Yes, that's what I'm just feeling like.
Okay, well, so we obviously call that yet something different. But does this entity instance thing work? Does anybody know? Will that work inside that polygon and things?
No idea.
I think it works for, at least for historical country, it worked.
All right, but so this claim that the default historical country polygon is the case of greatest extent seems like it's not a totally stupid default, but I see. This might be the case of greatest extent for Poland as things called Poland, as opposed to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Fair enough. So we may have done the right thing here. And greatest extent is defined as maximum area, not maximum extent lat long, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what's wrong with that? So therefore, I claim that the default interpretation, if you just give the historical country as the maximum extent polygon, is there a problem with that? I see. You're asking a different question. Should we scan through the whole history of the Roman Republic to ask whether essentially the union of all Roman Republic points contain Vesuvius?
Right. So the question is, when doing lookups, if we should stick to this concept of using the maximum extent, or we should extend to use the full time series. That would be the question here, right?
But if you do an intersection of the regions, let's see. Okay, so one suggestion is, given, Roman Republic, for example, we should have a property of that is the union of all territory that was ever contained in it. That would be a useful thing to have. Making sense? So in other words, one thing is the polygon, but there's also the aggregated polygon or something. You see what I'm saying?
Right. So that might be a different property. That's what you're thinking.
No, that's what I'm saying. That's not the polygon property. That's some kind of aggregated polygon. Right? And then that would be the thing. So you could imagine with geo within Q checking against the aggregated polygon if you didn't specify anything else. So there's the default polygon. If you just ask for the Roman Republic polygon, you get the polygon of maximum extent. If you ask for aggregated polygon, which might be the default in geo within Q, does that make sense?
This may be a geo-variant somehow.
Yes, that's what I was thinking, that maybe for that kind of thing, we should use a different way to specify that. So the default could be kept, but using geo-variant.
Wait a minute, I see. The default for polygon could be kept, but we'd say.
So right now we have not defined geo-variants for historical countries, but maybe we could define them, as you were saying, for example, aggregated all areas or aggregated area, a keyword for that.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. I mean, we haven't even talked about principal areas and things like that for historical countries. Like for example, let's take the British Empire, for instance. Arguably, I don't even know what, is the principal area of the British Empire Britain, or is it the whole, thing that was always colored pink on the maps that I had when I was a kid?
Yeah, for example, in the definition of country data, we defined that the principal area, we excluded the colonies from the principal area.
Okay,
all
fine.
the dependents. Yeah, so the colonies could be considered dependencies or not. That's
okay, fair enough. But then in that case, have we done that for historical countries? So like for the British?
No, right now, no.
Okay, so that's another thing we should look at.
Right, how to split the colonies from the mainland, let's say.
Okay, but so what are the possible interpretations of geo within Q? By the way, question on the live stream, point on the live stream about in current events, given that we're going to all this trouble with historical countries, maybe we can do something better with disputed borders in the current time. What do we do with Kashmir right now?
I think we were using the polygons from
what?
From OpenStreetMap. No, we were using the polygons from OpenStreetMap, which somehow tried to take the vision from UN at some point, but I don't know if that's still the case.
Well, but so in that case, a fine print says the attempted fine print is whatever the UN says is what we're saying. Is that the notion?
At some point, yeah. Yes, that's what we tried at some point. Yes. Not sure if that's the best view, of course.
Well, I understand. But I mean, I could imagine using geovariant to deal with disputed territories. Alan, do you have any comments on this?
Possibly. You're suggesting that we have
the Indian view and the
geo variant that's a disputed territory somehow tagged with which point of view we're
exactly. That the geovariant would be
yeah,
according to country X.
yeah.
I mean, that will give, you know, a huge can of worms, right? For Taiwan, for example, there's a huge can of worms.
You have to, if you do that, then in some countries' point of view, other countries do not actually exist.
Right. For example,
What do you
China
mean by
doesn't
exist? I mean,
for example, China is not recognized by Vatican City. So Vatican City recognizes Taiwan, but not China. So
not what?
So Vatican City recognizes Taiwan, but not mainland China.
Oh, but not mainland China.
Yeah.
But I don't know what recognizes means. That's probably not the main. I mean, it's not that they claim that there's a blank on the map there.
Right. But maybe they label that part of the map as Taiwan.
Oh gosh. Oh wow. Okay, but look, the use of geovariant to deal with disputed areas is something we maybe should consider, but I think that's not. So you've got 4 different interpretations for geo within Q. Is that correct?
Yes, we have different ways to try to attempt to say, okay, what do we want to mean really when we say geo within Q, Roman Republic, and Vesuvius? Should we just, interpretation-wise, but actually what you already said, is just set the default maximum area polygon versus the Mount Vesuvius, which is something that we already do in a trivial way.
Okay. Well, so but right. Okay, but I'm beginning to think that a better interpretation of point within area. What happens if it's a geo within Q of a historical country within another historical country?
That's our query number 2. That is way below.
Okay. Well, but so the question is, no, but I'm not Vesuvius, which is a point, right?
Yes.
Yes, you can scroll to the second, not to the second.
Oh, I see.
The second query, that's below.
Yep. So maybe we could start using this geovariant for different, making a difference between the same, let's say, all the aggregated points.
Look, the question is, if you say, is Italy within the, no, let's take another example. Is, oh gosh, what's a good example? Here's a good example. Is Lithuania within the Soviet Union? Right? So, if I'm not mistaken, at some point Lithuania had a big empire. And so it would not be the case that for all of history, Lithuania has been within the borders, I'm claiming, I don't actually know this for sure, has been within the borders of the aggregated polygon of the Soviet Union. In other words, the aggregated polygon of Lithuania has pieces that extend beyond the aggregated polygon of the Soviet Union. I claim. I don't know if that's correct history, but assume that's correct history. Right, so it's one thing if if, for example, that every piece of, I don't know, Belarus or something, Belarus, was everything that's ever been Belarus has always been contained within the maximum polygon of the Soviet Union, which is probably true, right?
But that's also temporal. So if you're asking, during the duration of Soviet Union, was Lithuania part of Soviet Union? Yes.
Oh
if
boy!
You're
right. If you ask about the pure pieces of land, it might not be true. But while the Soviet Union existed, was it always part? The answer might be yes. Actually, that might not be true either, because I'm sure there was a time when, for all of those countries, before they were invaded, so to speak, there was a time when the Soviet Union existed, when it hadn't yet got to Estonia or something, right? So the answer to that will be false. I mean, even if it's only, right, I'm sure if we look at the historical polygons there, we'd find that. So the question is, look, this is a question of defaults, and the default may not be all that useful.
Perhaps what we need here is to find a way of projecting the collections of all polygons in time to a single polygon. And it could be the first, the maximal, the union.
Well, right, but I mean that's what I'm saying. What I was calling the aggregate polygon is the union polygon for a given country.
Yes, what I mean is that perhaps we can give to the user the freedom through a geovariant of which method to use to combine.
I see. But as Gosha points out, there's another case, which is the time. It's a space-time problem. It's not just a space problem.
Yeah, that's the fully general case. Yeah.
So the question is, can the space-time can the geovariant also represent a space-time? I mean, so let's zoom out for a moment, okay? So we're just now getting the one-dimensional data interval stuff for times working. I believe as we do this spatial statistics stuff, are we going to wind up getting the spatial analog of that working, or is that not part of that project? Gosha, do you happen to know?
No, I mean, at this point, we use how to put it? We actually work with entities if they have polygons specified, but in our special project, we do not take dates in a way. So if you give a dated polygon, it's gonna be a fixed region in space. Then yes, we can work with that. But
no, I understand, but you could ask things like, does such and such a thing intersect with such and such a thing? The issue is, okay, so look, it's a hierarchy. It's like temporal logic, spatial logic, and then there's also a spatio-temporal logic.
Right. So at this point, we take whatever the geo intersection will tell us.
I understand. So that,
yes. So from we're gonna inherit whatever the geographics kind of is doing at this point.
Fair enough.
So if you decide whatever, kind of decide on how you work with this in entity world, we will just inherit that.
Okay, so this raises the question of, is there a form of graphics? I mean, we talked earlier about showing, a time series, geographics time series using opacity, basically. Basically what you're doing is every year you put another layer of opacity down, and then the years where the country was there a lot, the points where the country was there for many years, it'll be darker than the places where the country wasn't there for many years. But we could also imagine, I suppose, a 2+1 dimensional thing where we actually have a stack of geoplots going in a z direction. Is that a crazy thing? It's probably pretty crazy. I'm trying to understand the way to describe. I mean, what we ultimately want is this spatiotemporal surface or spatiotemporal volume, right? That represents the the historical borders of the country, if I'm not mistaken. And then we can ask questions about that, like of that spatiotemporal thing. Okay, so a question for in the regions, in the whole computational geometry system, we could perfectly well deal with that object, couldn't we?
I think so. It's some sort of cylinder. Yeah.
Right. So one question is, can we generate that? So what we should see is, for the Roman Empire, for example, we should see this thing. Maybe that one comes into existence as a big slab of stuff, but eventually, some countries might start at a point. I don't know, as I don't know, Venice, for example, might start at a point and then expand and make a big empire, and then contract back to a point again in this spatiotemporal way. So we could imagine making the 3D surface that is that.
Mm-hmm.
And
a world tube.
Yeah, it's a world. It's not quite a world sheet. What the heck is it? It's a world. It's not a world line.
It's called a world tube.
What are you saying? World tube or world?
Tube, T-U-B-E.
Okay, world tube. Okay, fair enough. And pretty soon we'll be doing string theory on countries as well. But no, okay, so fair enough. So we could imagine making such a thing and being able to convert. I mean, it might be fun to just try and make some of those and see whether they're useful. Because if we got that, and we can do geo-coordinates, right? So let's say in that world tube that we successfully could have geo-coordinates and time coordinates. Then in principle, okay, so I don't know what the state of the region system supporting units is. Does anybody know?
I think it does not yet.
Right, but so if the units, so by the way, this case, and it's worth communicating that to the region people, that the case where the units are not the same in different dimensions, which I bet they have not considered. Right, because what you want is the units in one direction are, miles or whatever, and in the other direction are years. Right, so can somebody communicate that? Who can communicate that to the computational geometry folk?
I can tell them.
Okay. But then, so in other words, the Roman Empire could be considered to have a certain, in units of square miles by years, it had a certain extent. That should be interesting to know. Now I'm very curious. This is the kind of question that Christopher would like, is which country has had the highest, spatiotemporal volume in history? Okay.
Probably China. But
you reckon China? Okay. Well, we can. Actually, it's a shame Christopher isn't on this call. He knows a lot about these random things. Okay. Well, we probably should wrap up here, but so we basically have not resolved this question of what geo within Q should exactly do. Is that a fair assessment?
Yep. But we can start exploring all these geovariant cases.
I think that would be useful, yeah. And then if you implement some of those, then right. Oh gosh.
Yeah, because for example, something that
issues here. Go ahead. Sorry.
Something that would also mean the aggregated could be dated and an interval or all. So that how we would consider the dated wrapper when it's not a point.
I understand. Yeah, right. That's an interesting one as well. I mean, I think this notion of a spatiotemporal world tube thing may be what we'll end up having to think about, because I don't really see how what else is dated Roman Empire comma interval. I mean, one could choose to say it's the Union, but I think that's a wimp out, because I mean, these are tricky questions, right? This was Lithuania always within the Soviet Union, right? It's a little unclear what you mean by that. I mean, if we were doing that as a natural language thing, we might have some assumings around that. Perhaps we should think about let's give this challenge. Let's consider these kinds of weird cases of geo within Q and so on, and let's consider what is the natural language version of the queries that would lead to these different things, and then what assumings will we generate to represent these different cases. Okay, and maybe that can help inform what we actually want to do. Because in fact, we probably do want to have, we will want to make these work in Wolfram Alpha with assumings and so on. Okay, let's just look at the live stream quickly. Oh, okay, that's an interesting. I did not know that piece of history. Kashmir is a Pakistani population but had a Hindu king. Okay. Transnistria is recognized by no nations but fought a war against Moldova and is a country. Wow. Well, again, this is one of these, it's like, if it has a UN code, then it's a country, and if it doesn't, then it isn't, from our point of view. I mean, which is kind of a wimp out, but it's because we're not, in that business. Let's see. Oh, that's an interesting idea. If you use dated of historical country, comma, all to mean the Union. Yeah, the Union territory, for example. So that's an interesting idea. Go ahead.
That's something. Yes, that's something we should explore. But as you said, that might mean also the volume in a different way. But, yeah.
Right, but I mean, the problem is if you say dated of historical country, comma, an interval of dates, and then you do geographics of that, I think ultimately we want this opacity thing for that. And then all might want to be the complete opacity story rather than the pure Union story. Okay. Oh, I see another comment here that okay, our geometric computation team is doing a live stream tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern about new features in geometric computation in version 12. So for people on the live stream who are interested in such stuff, do tune in. All right, we should wrap for now. We are going to have to continue this. Boy, so many complicated issues. Oh boy. Oh, wow. Yeah, this is complicated. I'm telling you, space-time is what we're going to have to talk about. Yeah, does geo within Q mean geodate within Q or not? See, you could want either thing. You shouldn't have used Vesuvius as your first example because it's too easy. Well, not necessarily. It depends on how much of Vesuvius blew up. But no, the mountain was still there. Is there much left of Krakatoa? I don't know. Do we have a notion of Krakatoa? Is that a... It's a volcano, but Seth is asking if there's a way to include all territories for plots of nations. That's what GeoVariant is supposed to do, right? GeoVariant can give you that, can't it?
Right, with all areas. That's the...
Well, that's all areas means. So if I do that for the US, what's going to happen? If I say GeoList plot of GeoVariant of United States, all areas, is this going to show Guam and things as well? Why is it taking so long? Is this not cached? Ah.
Yes, it shows, and also Puerto Rico, which was asked.
That's interesting. Okay, cool. So that's the answer to Seth's question. Thanks for the comments on the live stream. That this has been interesting. Yes, we've been working on history for a long time, and this is only this is just a corner of what has had to be done there. Check out military conflicts for another giant can of worms that we think we've got reasonable resolution on. All right. Well, thanks to everybody here. We will have to continue this hopefully within a week or so. And thanks for all the comments on the live stream. And hopefully we didn't offend too many countries and so on in this discussion. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye.